Hello, welcome to the Theology Podcast, and from that music you hear in the background, you know that we are live. The band is together again here in Manchester, Connecticut, and we've begun our worldwide tour. Actually, not yet. We are planning on that, though. And I know that my friends out in the Northwest would love to have us come out. They've already talked to me about the Pacific Northwest, places where we could have the show, and you guys actually have groupies out there. You don't even know it. They're just people out there just think you're wonderful and great and prefer you to me. Anyway, so I'm C.R. Wiley. I am a pastor, and I'm currently serving a church in Vancouver, Washington. Not British Columbia, but Vancouver, Washington, the real Vancouver. And it's right across the river from Portland. Yes, that Portland in Oregon. And so I'm glad to be here. I made it through the riots. No one harmed me at all. By the way, things are really overstated. Portland's a fine place. You know, if you go into a particular part of the city at the wrong time of day or night, you'll see some things. But generally speaking, people are actually, productive citizens and going to work and doing things and shopping and all that kind of stuff. But you probably already knew that unless you watch certain programs, and that's all you know about Portland is the riots. But anyway, enough of all that. The church I serve is the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Vancouver, and you are welcome to attend anytime. I won't be there this coming Sunday, though, but this show will be, posted after that Sunday anyway, so there you go. And, that's enough about me. So how about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am currently a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University until the end of this semester.
Woohoo!
And I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
So now the word is out. It's official. We can talk about it. All right. And what are they going to do to you now? Fire you?
To be perfectly honest with you, we may have groupies all over the place, but they aren't at my university.
That's too bad for them.
Tom Price, systematic theologian, Christian ethicist, teaching both at a variety of places, one of which is Gordon Conwell. And still, so far, so good. But you never know when you'll be retiring, or pushed into it. So we're always open to possibilities. Let's put it that way. But I'm going to be writing this summer. We'll talk more about that as we get there. And by the way, I didn't mention, but both Glenn and I had a tiny little blurb in the most recent. What is the name of the magazine?
The Fight, Laugh, Feast. I don't remember what they called it, but their magazine.
Their magazine. So our audience out there should know better than us, because we always catch on a little late. But we have some little article on joy there, and amongst other articles with Doug Wilson and the rest of the gang. But I thought I'd throw it out there. They were very proud of that.
You guys out there in podcast land ought to subscribe. It's a great publication. Anyway. Thanks, Tom. Well, why don't we jump into the topic of the day? And the topic of the day, it's my day, by the way. I come from the West bearing the topic of the day. And it's individualism. I want to talk about individualism. And what prompted my reflections on individualism is a review of Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And it's reviewed in a really... I think insightful review by Ben Dunson, and the title of his review is Plastic Man. But as I read the review, I thought, this stuff that Carl is treating here is really kind of well-plowed ground. This is stuff that people who have some background in the history of Western thought, particularly in the modern era, folks are pretty familiar with this stuff. The problem is that hardly anybody outside of our little cadre of people who actually have studied this stuff know anything about it, but they're being swept along by it. They think what they're doing is common sense, but from the historical perspective, it's novel, it's kind of insane, and it's a departure from the common sense of the past. But as I thought about Carl's treatment, he gets into various writers in his treatment There was a Reef. Who was the guy who was is it Paul Reef? A guy who wrote.
Oh, that's about
Philip Reef. Yeah,
about the
therapeutic self. Yeah. So he's getting into the therapeutic stuff, and I thought to myself, this just sounds like Habits of the Heart for Robert Bellah. That great book in the 1980s was the work of the group of sociologists.
There are, from my perspective as a historian, there are some real advantages to living in an era of cultural illiterates.
That's right.
Because you can pull out things from just a few decades ago and they will seem fresh and new.
That's right. And you look really smart.
And you can pull stuff out that the actual literate enlightened would have known where it was coming from and rejected. Today they have no clue what it is. So you could actually also train minds in new directions.
That's right. Yeah, there are various works that I've worked with in my writing. Today I was just reviewing Xenophon's Oikonomikos and his book on household management. It's a Socratic dialogue, and when people kind of refer to it in an offhanded way, it's pretty easy to know whether or not they actually have read it or not. Just based on the kind of remarks. If it's boilerplate, sort of treatment of, say, patriarchy or whatever, that they've not read the book or read the dialogue, because there's all sorts of stuff in the dialogue that actually undermines that interpretation. But getting back to Habits of the Heart, so Robert Bellah led a team of sociologists who did field research, and what they wanted to understand was the relationship between individualism and commitment. That's, by the way, the subtitle of the book. Individualism and Commitment in American Life. I don't know if it's still in print, but it was a bestseller back in the 80s. I think probably like mid-80s, maybe 84, 85, 86. In fact, I've got the book right here. Why don't I look in the front? That's an idea. Look in the front. It was reviewed by everybody. Publishers Weekly, Los Angeles Times, the Times Higher Education Supplement. So, it was a big deal when it came out. 85, there you go. So, anyway, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, what do we mean when we talk about individualism? What is individualism? Then I would like to get into the sociologists in this book and their treatment. I'll just say Bellah, but he has, a lot of people who helped him with this, but I'll just refer to this as Bellah's book. And get into his taxonomy of American individualism, and he identifies different schools of thought or different ways of being an individual in America, which I think might catch people by surprise. And I'll give you my thoughts on that. But why don't we just jump off or jump from the starting point jump into it from the starting point. What are we talking about when we talk about individualism? Is this something new? Is it a recent development? If it's always been, understood, if we've always had what we refer to as individualism, why does it seem like it's a new thing? Any thoughts?
I immediately go to the Swiss art historian from the 19th century, Jakob Burckhardt, and this is not American individualism. But Burckhardt said that he wrote a book on the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And it was, in some ways, sort of a groundbreaking book, but what it really did was just sort of coalesce the thinking on the Renaissance from the period. It really encapsulated it, and it really dominated discussions of the Renaissance from that time on. And one of the things that he argued is that the Renaissance was the time of the discovery of the individual.
It's an interesting way of putting it, isn't it?
And he said that, prior to this, medieval people thought of themselves as a member of a group, as a member of a tribe, a town, a culture, something like that. They didn't think of themselves as individuals.
Right.
And in the Renaissance, they discovered the individual. Now, I would say that that's patent nonsense, because in the Middle Ages, everybody knew you stood one-on-one before God and answered to him personally. Mm-hmm. So that kind of shoots down to me the idea that individualism was invented in the Renaissance. But I think, though, that it points toward a different, with Burckhardt's analysis, which, like I said, was wrong, points toward the first step toward a development of a definition of individualism, which is seeing yourself primarily as a unique person more than as a representative of a group or as a part of a collective of some sort.
Right. That reminds me of Harold Bloom's book on Shakespeare, The Invention of the Individual. I think that's what it was called.
Yeah.
But same idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see all the shifts going on there. I mean, you already in the medieval period when you're talking about sort of universals and what it means to be a human being and a particular instantiation of it, shifting to the particular being the center of focus and action. You flesh that out over time. I think the Renaissance was really capturing that, where I think what Christianity brings and brought to, especially the world, if you will, is a new kind of way of looking at the dignity of the human being individually in relation to God and also in relationship to everything else. And so the personality took on significance. But what happens, I think, as we creep towards individualism is the individual almost becomes the center of what's fascinating and interesting about it. Even in theology, for example, you're shifting away from God being fascinating for God's own sake to the human being made in the image of God now starting to become fascinating, and couple that with every distinct particular individual is unique with this nominalist strand, and then you get this kind of concentration of human beings each individually being fascinating in their own way.
Let's kind of break that down a little bit, Tom, because I think it's worth exploring. You in an offhanded way, you mentioned nominalism. Now, I think what I hear you saying when you refer to nominalism within the framework of understanding individualism is nominalism sort of gets rid of the universal categories. Just generally speaking about everything, and everything is particularized. Everything is so like we can't talk about leaves being sort of instantiations of leafness. Instead, we just talk about each individual leaf being its own thing.
And so any way of categorizing it now is more convention or social construct than dealing with a real reality to which all these things participate in.
Yeah, and many times we've gone back and forth about the Platonic approach or the Aristotelian approach, how you get to the universals, but both believed that there were universals that you could arrive at. The question was, how do you go about it? But I think that's the thing, so if every particular person is like a universe unto itself, with its own kind of internal laws, then the question then is not what makes you unique, but then how do you possibly relate to anybody else?
And that and that starts to bully up as you get into the current period, the emphasis on everyone almost demanding to be related to in light of their own self-definition.
That's right. Yeah.
Although you have to be careful there, because with intersectionality, which we should probably hold off on for a bit. But with intersectionality, you've really got to approach it from a different direction.
That's right, and it gets messy. And I get this is down the road, but it's not. It's individualism, but it starts to get tribalized again. But we'll get to that.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the Christian roots, and I think of individualism, because I do think when we think about, the individual. In a positive way and constructively today, I think we can look back to the incarnation. There we have an individual, Christ, and we have someone who genuinely is unique. He is the God-man. So there's something about his embodied life that's significant that we study, and so forth. That's one thing. But also Augustine and the Confessions. I've heard, secular scholars say that the Confessions is the first true autobiography in the history of the world.
Yeah.
He gives us an inner look at his inner life.
I heard read someone who said that in the Confessions, Augustine is the first person in history to use the word I the way a modern person does.
That's right. Yeah, when you read Confessions, now he might not be your favorite cup of tea, Now, I enjoy reading Augustine. Mm-hmm. There are points where he gets a little bit, sappy for me, but in terms of what you just said, when I read him, I do feel like I'm reading someone who might be, next door. Maybe he lived a couple hundred years ago, but somebody a lot closer to you or me than, say, when I'm reading some other ancient author. So interesting stuff. Now, back to Habits of the Heart. And what they're interested in is American life. So this isn't just modern world. They're thinking about Americans. And they have a very interesting approach. First of all, they do a lot of surveys. These are sociologists, after all. And so, what sociologists actually are is they're kind of political philosophers who kind of pretend to be scientists. That's my take on them. But and then
I have a few others, but we'll skip mine.
But generally, what they do is they have a thesis and they go out and they find the proof for it. So, but I don't think that they were off when it came to their analysis of American culture in the 80s. And I think what concerned them then is even more the case today. So let me give you a little picture of what I'm talking about. So they identified 4 strains of American individualism. 2 they identify as positive and 2 as negative. What they were concerned about is the growing cultural or sort of anti-culture and its influence on American life from the 2 negative ways of approaching the individual or thinking about the individual. So here they are, and they helpfully give you historic sort of personalities of people from the past to embody the outlook that they're talking about. The first is biblical individualism, and for biblical individualism they identify Cotton Mather, which makes a lot of sense. And then there's Republican individualism, and that's a second form of positive individualism. And for that, to exemplify that outlook, it's Thomas Jefferson. Utilitarian individualism, which is one of the negative ones, is Ben Franklin. Now, if we got a lot of Ben Franklin fans out there, I'm sorry, but Ben is not what you read about in Poor Richard's Almanac. He was not that guy. He was a very... Well, we'll get into it later. But then the third is expressive individualism and Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, the poet. Now, it's no coincidence that expressive individualism and Walt Whitman is the most recent, and biblical individualism is the furthest in the past. Okay, so Republican individualism and biblical individualism are in decline, and utilitarian individualism and expressive individualism are ascendant. Now, how do these values get assigned to these various approaches to the individual? Well, biblical individualism and Republican individualism have this in common: the individual finds himself or herself through serving the community. So the biblical, obviously, is the body image that Paul uses in Corinthians, where he talks about one is an eye, one is a hand, so forth. So there's an individual, this hand, this eye, whatever, but our lives add up to something bigger than ourselves. Our lives add up to the body of Christ, right? So we're participating in the life of Christ. And through our mutual regard and service, and even as we turn to the world and attempt to serve those outside the church, we are the body, acting as the body of Christ, and we need each other to do what we are called to do. So that's biblical individualism. Republican individualism really is the classical understanding of the individual in the community. This is sort of the idea that the polis, the city, is the place that we all depend on. We're social animals, as Aristotle put it. And we find our place, again, in terms of how we serve our community. What's different between these two, obviously, is that we're not talking about the biblically revealed God, in terms of how we relate to God and as His people. Instead, we're talking about what we might call, but I think this is a little misleading, we might say is a more secular way of thinking about it. But nevertheless, you get involved in your community. The people who think in this way would be, the people who work for who volunteer to be, like a director of the Lions Club, or some community organization. Even get involved with politics. Maybe become a local, councilman or something like that, or maybe just volunteer down at the library. These are people who say, my place in the world. My sense of self is arrived at through this sort of social engagement that I'm involved in, and I want to be a contributor. I don't want to just be a taker. Now we all receive, but I also want to give. That's the key. Now, so those are the two positive forms of individualism, according to Bella. The negative forms of individualism are utilitarian individualism and expressive individualism. So utilitarian individualism is essentially the community, it has to justify itself to the individual, and it's justified to the individual insofar as it helps the individual achieve his or her goals. So it's got utility. The community has utility in this sense. And the example given is Ben Franklin. Now, that people who know a little bit about Franklin might object. I mean, after all, he was involved in all kinds of social sort of community endeavors in different ways. And I'd say that's fair. But I also think that if we want to see who was the father of the self-help book, who was the sort of like the guy who wrote the first one, at least in America, it's probably Franklin. It's all about kind of understanding how you can kind of get ahead. And even as Franklin talked about many of his, positive contributions to the city of Philadelphia, as you read him, I mean, you can't miss that Franklin sees how he's getting something out of this. He's doing things, but there's a sense in which it's always Franklin who seems to kind of get ahead, in the process. So anyway, well, to give an example of this, you remember Franklin was the publisher of Whitefield, George Whitefield.
That's
so
right.
Now was Franklin a believer? No. What Franklin saw was a great opportunity to make some money.
Yeah.
And he even made fun of himself in the process, and he even praised Whitefield. There's that great story he tells when Whitefield is taking an offering for an orphanage. You remember this one?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to tell it, Glenn?
Well, long story short, Franklin said that he had absolutely no intention at all of giving any money, but he just wanted to hear Whitefield preach and watch what was going on and so on. And by the end of it, he'd emptied his pockets.
That's right. Yeah, and of course, the way Franklin tells us, he says, first I was going to give a pence, and then I was going to give a shilling. He just takes you up, he's like, I'm emptying my pockets, throwing it in the dog. But even then, Franklin made a mint off of Whitefield. He sold tons and tons of books. So anyway, this kind of gives you that. Now the last, and by the way, who is the sort of the personification of the first three? Well, the personification, obviously, of the first might be a pastor, might be a nun, might be someone who's involved in some kind of charitable work in a hospital or in a prison system or something like that, who's serving the world or serving the church as a deacon or an elder, and through that activity of putting the community first, discovers who he or she is. Right. In the second case, what are we talking about? We're talking about people who serve the community, maybe through being on the board of the library or maybe running for office, that kind of thing. In the case of Franklin, and people who are utilitarian individualists, the personification that Bella and his colleagues present is the entrepreneur. It'd be Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the utilitarian individualist. Now, you could say, well, think about all the great things Elon Musk has done, and you'd say, yeah, but again, he's using opportunities to, well, in his words, maybe get us to another planet, help the human species survive. But Musk features very prominently in anything Musk says. In other words, he's a little bit like Trump. Just got a different approach, sort of different bedside manner. The third persona who embodies or exemplifies the fourth approach or outlook, and this is expressive individualism, is Walt Whitman. What's that? Leaves of Grass or Fields of... No, it's Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass was his work. But anyway, this is very much in the romantic mode and romantic tradition, sort of the idea that essentially it's your emotive self, not your rational self, but your emotive self, not your social self. So you can think about it that way. What do we mean when we're talking about individualism? Is that you're biblical, theological, biblical self? You know, your religious self that defines you? Is it your social self, your political self that defines you? Is it your acquisitive, builder self that defines you? Or is it your emotive self? How you feel.
And it's something, and there's something that's very, in all of them, there's a certain kind of self-determination, but there is almost a self-definition the further you move towards, where that experience, that sense of self, that sense of consciousness, and that experiencing consciousness becomes something that we almost legislate reality for ourselves. That's what the expressive side of it. Yeah.
Now with the expressive self, with the expressive self, everyone is Walt Whitman. Everyone's a poet.
Yeah.
And poiesis, self-making. The idea that my greatest work of art is me.
Yeah. I'm a walking piece of art.
That's right. I'm making myself every day, and tomorrow I may be. And Whitman was accused of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, he was accused of contradicting himself. And he said, "No matter, I embody multitudes." That's a paraphrase. I don't think that's exactly the way he said it, but it gets the point across.
But this fluidity of a self, it's becoming, and
very protean.
There is no telos other than sort of one's experiencing self.
Yeah. So I think that listeners in podcast land know where this is going. Mm-hmm. So this was 1985, and they were concerned. They felt that the two forms of individualism that actually built up community, were social in nature, were in decline. And the forms of individualism which were selfish and self-centered, narcissistic, were ascendant. Now, this society has to serve the individual by endorsing whatever the individual says about him or herself.
And that's what Charles Taylor often talked about, is that bringing into recognition now becomes something that authenticates a expressive self.
That's it.
So to have others recognize it, the failure of others to recognize is almost an assault on our expression.
Yeah, it's like kind of a violence. But this is the paradox of expressive individualism. Now the community is more necessary than ever.
And this is the way that the postmodern political apparatus, if you will, ingeniously, if not demonically, came in and re-tribalized.
Yes, and it demonstrates really just how I just think illiterate our intellectuals, sort of public intellectuals are today.
Yeah.
I don't think we kind of quipped early on in the show about being original because we just remember things that people wrote 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But all this stuff they saw it coming. Everybody saw it coming.
Yeah.
We think about Abolition of Man with C.S. Lewis. He saw it coming. We think about, individualism kind of run amok. We can think of, The Culture of Narcissism by, Christopher Lasch. By the way, that's another great book we ought to talk about sometime. And then this, which was written, published within a few years of Culture of Narcissism. I think Culture of Narcissism was like 78, maybe 79, 80, something like that. Anyway, so everybody was worried. And all the worries have been proven to be true. They were really things you should have been worried about. But now we can't even remember that we were worried.
That's right. Well, I remember even more on a more lay kind of intellectual training levels, Francis Schaeffer's later work How Then Shall We Live? His video series. You watch the last 3 or 4 of those stand out in my mind from reading in the 80s.
Right.
Don't want to date myself, but it was always talking about what's going to happen when this sort of, at this time he called it a Christian consensus, starts to become sentimental and then govern nothing. Well, what's filling that vacuum? And a rise of elites are going to basically come and fill that gap, and they're arbitrarily going to create these absolutes, and these are going to start to become, these people were telling the church, much less the intellectual community, this stuff was there. Right. I remember when I was studying through a lot of the more postmodern thinkers in Oxford, I was aware it was there and I understood it, but I think there was still something not real to me that people were really going to take this stuff seriously. I think that was my big naivety. I think I thought we all thought that common sense would prevail. Yeah.
How foolish.
People talk about things being on a pendulum.
Mm-hmm.
And, pendulum swings one way, then it swings the other, and so on. And so if it goes too far in one direction, don't worry, it'll correct. The problem with that is that sometimes when it swings too far in one direction, it breaks off the hub and keeps flying.
Yeah.
And right now, I have a feeling the pendulum is in ballistic free fall.
Yeah, and there are certain institutions, ironically, which is a bad word for an expressive individualist. There are certain institutions that make expressive individualism plausible.
Yeah.
When people vote, I think people actually have sort of a deep understanding of this, because expressive individualists all seem to vote a certain way, and it's for a growth of the welfare state, so that the choices that they make that do not serve the community or even themselves, in the long term, are mitigated, and the effects are ameliorated and spread out over the total population, and so people can kind of have a mulligan, or have a kind of declare bankruptcy in a sense, and say, well, I don't have to pay for any of my choices. There are going to be these institutions that take care of me when I, the chickens come home to the roosters, so to speak.
Well, in one of the kind of strategic political philosophies, if you will, is such that it can capitalize on this in a way that it can advance all of the other things by making people feel that they're being liberated by being able to have a parameter where they can self-define. So if we give everyone this this space to define themselves however they want to do it, and we enforce that, we get their loyalty to all these other kinds of things, and then spill that over. I mean, the church, and you talk about illiteracy. The church is, first of all, it's adopted hook, line, and sinker a kind of individualism that is antithetical to
I think that you can define most church plants in the last 30 years as being either expressive individualist or utilitarian.
Absolutely. They're working off of, and this is one of the things, originally when I started out doing systematic theology, that strong focus, which I think has to be the God-centered origin and ends of all things. But what you see is where that problem sits is the anthropological correlate to that. Mm-hmm. What is the image of God in this case? And what you see already is especially in the popular world of social media, you see everyone scoring points on where they fall on who's the good guys, who's the oppressor, already buying into, of course, the trends of the culture, but also so far removed from Christian anthropology that they don't even know what they're defending has nothing to do with it.
They couldn't even tell you what anthropology means.
That's right. Oh, yeah. Oh, wait, since it's anthros and has it's patriarchy, they've gotten rid of that.
Patriarchy again.
Got to get rid of that word. Got to get rid of it. It's just, yeah. But
yeah, wild stuff.
But this is, and I think what you see here, though, is you start to see, and we've all seen it, the inability for people to distinguish their Christian faith in the kind of absolute commitments that are central to it, the life of holiness, to being nothing more than adaptations of this religion of the self expression, the yoga self, if you will. And
that's right, the yoga self. We got to brand that. Tom Price, the yoga self. Now,
how to disrupt your yoga self.
Well, but the yoga self. When we, a couple directions I'd like to take this, because whenever we see, say, Madison Avenue, which is the advertising part of New York City, right? So the ad men, or the ad, I don't know, persons or whatever they got now, the ad people, whenever they want to convey some sense of religiosity, what forms or what images do they use? They always use the person in the lotus position. They never show somebody in a church receiving communion. They never see you never see a baptism. You never see even somebody with the Bible open and reading. You don't even see Jewish or Islamic or even Hindu expressions. It's always the yoga, the lotus position. And what do we know about that? If there was an outlook that was sort of like kind of inwardly turned, it's that. When we look at the yoga self, what's the person doing? The eyes are closed, and it's a turning in on the self.
Yeah.
Now, anybody who understands Buddhism knows it's the obliteration of the self that's the goal, but not popular New Age stuff.
That's right. So yeah, and it's similar to postmodernism. It is the obliteration of the self, but not popular postmodernism.
Right.
I mean,
right.
I mean, I was reading George Grant, not the pastor.
Yeah, down in Nashville.
That's right. I was reading the Canadian philosopher.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
And so one of the things he was talking about, his great essay, I think it's called Time and Eternity. They're all running together in my head right now. But one of the things he's talking about in that is the shift from the Christian vision to what we end up today. But he says it really starts with a radical distinction between what used to be a soul and now is a self.
Yeah, wow.
And I was thinking, I mean, actually one of the things I'm thinking of doing is already putting together a class on contemporary views of the self and then retrieving a lot of this, because I think that's worth exploring a lot.
Yeah.
And he doesn't unpack it a lot there, but he definitely gives someone a book idea. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, a book idea to a guy named Tom Price.
That's right. Adding one more to the list. But I think this is very fundamental. I think we've lost in many cases, even as we've kind of carried on some of the biblical language within our churches. We've lost a lot of the core aspects.
Well, this is a thing that I think people can be easily sort of duped by. So, like, if you are a conservative Protestant and you go to a mainline evangelical, or not evangelical, but a mainline church, mainline Protestant church, you'll hear a number of things that you'll be familiar with, but what they mean by them, there are new assigned meanings to everything that's being stated. So if you think that only happened in the mainline, you're mistaken. Right. It's happened in evangelicalism, particularly in the kinds of evangelicalism that we've been talking about, utilitarian and expressive.
And I think this is, I'm not original with this, but we hear it all the time, but I think where we really see it is that quick step from the spiritual to the therapeutic.
Yes.
In a very kind of secular therapy sense of the word. Not that there isn't a validity to the therapeutic once we understand the human being in proper
therapy just means healing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's totally cut off from genuine care of souls in the pastoral office and ministerial office. And now the pastor. I mean, I remember some years ago. I don't remember the name of the book. Do you remember this one? The Secular Priest. I mean, it was basically. I think it was Freud's definition for what the therapist was. And in the idea in the book, and again, I don't know the historical accuracy, but it was that Freud almost picks up this idea of being the therapist from the ministerial office.
Yeah.
And he's just baptizing, or what's the reversal of baptism? Debaptism. He's taking the baby out of the water.
That's right.
Reversing it.
Right. Let's dry that baby off.
Yeah.
Right.
And but you and I think you see. I mean, we've increasingly seen over the years. I have is this shift from. I'll just give you an example of how stark it was. I remember my time in Oxford finishing my doctoral work. I stayed in the Eastern Orthodox. They housed.
Right, sure.
And when you went, I'm not saying it doesn't slip in there either. I'm not trying to find purity points here.
Right.
But I remember first evening there. Oh, come down. We're doing Jesus prayer. Come down. We're focusing on what it means to. I mean, the classic Christian practices of focusing on Christ and spirituality. Right. Those are nowhere anymore, other than some prayer, and most of that tends to be prayer not directed towards our conversion to God, but is about how we are made whole in a therapeutic sense.
Right.
And I understand the Western antecedents to that, but I think what ends up happening is it's sort of what I think Philip Reif is on to. The whole proper spiritual setting in which therapy is able to carry out its real work has been ripped from it in its classic Christian spirituality, and now is being filled with this kind of expressivist.
Yeah, and it's everywhere.
And along with that, we can. I mean, a lot of the fundamental problem is not only loss of anthropology; it's a complete redefinition of hamartology, which is a rather obscure word meaning the doctrine of sin.
Yep.
If you look at the culture. What they want, particularly prior to the current Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. What the culture was really clamoring for was unrestricted personal freedom, meaning unrestricted personal sexual freedom,
Right.
enforced by rigid government regulation.
That's right.
Yeah, that was my point earlier.
But a lot of that thinking has, so that's sort of morphed into victim status.
Mm-hmm.
And what it's done is, in the culture, the only idea that's left of something that's truly wrong or evil is oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And thus the oppressed are innocent, the oppressors are guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly the same thing is now moving into the evangelical churches.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
One of the things related to that I think is intriguing is the loss of a concept of virtue that has nothing to do with this oppressor-oppressed rubric. Mm-hmm. In other words, perhaps your oppression is due to the fact that somebody is better than you at something and it makes you unhappy. Mm-hmm. You know,
well,
maybe that's the source of your oppression. Maybe it's just envy.
It actually goes a step further. Anytime in the theory, functionally, they'll never say this, but anytime there's a disparity of outcomes between two different groups, it must be caused by oppression.
Right.
So
right.
The fact that children, by cross-cultural meta studies, children do best in families with married biological parents.
Right.
That's true universally. Well, that is only because we live in a patriarchal society that has normalized that form of marriage, and that if society were truly equal, then any possible configuration of households would have the same results.
Yeah, I've actually heard people with a straight face and sort of willing to take it to this logical conclusion, propose that we really need to abolish the traditional household in order to, produce equality of outcomes.
Yeah,
right. Because if this gives you some kind of advantage, then, well, we can't have that. It's better that we're all imbeciles.
Yeah.
And that we're all unproductive and sort of wrapped up in our own vices than to have any virtuous people at all.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I think, the kind of courage that's missing in the church today is the ability to push back, to use their language, on terms like equity and equality, because they're thin air terms.
Yep.
Don't steal them from a tradition shaped by Christianity and Western society to cut its roots off and then act like that word has any kind of
meaning, right?
It doesn't. And if you're going to actually make a moral case that justifies, especially use of violence and force for others to conform to it, you've got to do more than just this is ethical positivism. I've seen the kind of force presentation and the destruction these ideas are having, but I tend to be on the side to think they're so thin and incapable as categories for dealing with reality that it doesn't have long teeth.
I agree.
Yeah.
My fear is that because we have so much equity, cultural and actual, monetary equity, and the world is structured in such a way so as to, if the United States were to enter into a significant decline, it would affect the entire world in a very negative way.
Yeah.
So I think that we have a lot of people who will kind of engage in brinkmanship for a long, long time. An example of how this can work in a different way, when you think about, the subprime mortgage crisis back in 2008, basically the United States bailed out all these stupid bankers. So essentially we said, not only are we going to bail you out, we're going to let you take even more money. You're all going to walk away. Now, I think that had a role in sort of the, I think the disillusion of our many young people today when it comes to, capitalism, et cetera, because they say, okay, I see how this works. And nobody who's rich has to pay for the stupidity. Now, in Iceland didn't do that. They actually jailed the bankers, and Iceland bounced back just fine. Yeah. In other words, it didn't have to happen the way it did in the United States. Those criminals, could have been and should have been, but But
They
we
were
don't-
looking out for the other criminals that were bailing them out.
That's right. So now, be that as it may, I think that what that means is that there is a long fuse here to this bomb,
Yes.
and you and I are probably not going to see it blow up. You know, it's
That's
probably beyond the horizon of our lifetimes.
Yeah, I see that. I think just in terms of the way I see on a popular level, the way in which everything has to be explained within a kind of reductionism that really is deliberately causing people to not be able to grapple with basic reality.
Right.
That reality is such that it's going to push against that. So yeah, you're going to have to go in directions of either more and more control, which the mechanisms are there, I think.
Yep.
But you can't. The imagination is going to have to come up with a lot more than what's been happening in order to make.
Yeah. Now this kind of gets us into a whole other matter. I personally believe that this whole COVID shamdemic. I heard that phrase used the other day, and I thought it was great. The shamdemic. Everywhere I go, where the institutions, and I don't name them, and I don't post where I see these things on social media because I want to protect these havens of sanity. But wherever I go, where they ignore all that stuff, people are healthy, the institutions are growing.
Yeah.
So I think that we had an opportunity here to exercise a little bit of common sense on the ground, and we've failed massively.
Yeah.
We've failed massively, and it's putting us in a position of vulnerability. I think the institutions that could resist have been weakened, deeply weakened.
Yeah.
And because they're weakened right now because they don't even meet.
Yeah.
or they're meeting on in ways that are controlled by the very people that we should be most concerned about.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Well, you actually have to take this back a couple of steps because we've been living in a culture that's been dominated by the cult of safety.
Yes.
And anything that makes you feel safe is good, and anything that makes you feel unsafe is bad, and you must run and hide from it.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. It all kind of plays into kind of a larger framework. By the way, I want to before I forget, because a little while back we talked about this sort of the crazy cult of equality. I want to introduce folks in podcast land to a great story by Kurt Vonnegut, Harrison Bergeron. It's a very short story. It's found in his Welcome to the Monkey House collection of short stories. But Harrison Bergeron is it's darkly comic, but everything that Vonnegut wrote was darkly comic. He wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, didn't he? Yeah. So anyway, here are the first two paragraphs of Harrison Bergeron. The year was 2081, and everyone was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution. And to the unceasing vigilance of the agents of the United States Handicapper General. Diana Moon Glampers is her name. It tells you everything you need to know about her in the story. But anyway, the second paragraph. Some things about living weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy for not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. Now, in the story, I'll give it away. I'm not one of these people who honors, anything related to spoilers. I spoil movies for people without any qualms of conscience. So the story goes is that Harrison is 7 feet tall, incredibly powerful and athletic, and is the smartest man in the world. So not only is he the best-looking man, the most physically powerful man, and the best-looking man, and for all those reasons, he's public enemy number one.
He'd be right higher for the ladies' tennis team.
But what happens in the story is that he escapes. and he breaks into a television broadcast that's actually sending out a warning to the entire population of the United States that Harrison Bergeron is on the loose. And he breaks in and he declares himself emperor of the world. Anyway, I won't tell you how the story ends. You need to read that part for yourself. But but it's intended to be a parody not only of equalitarians, but also of Nazis. It's sort of the fascist sort of cult of the Superman.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So it's both. It's both, and the passivity of the population, because in the story, George and Hazel see their son killed on television, and can't bring themselves to do anything about it for a variety of reasons.
And you see that. I mean, Nietzsche, for example, who was, I think, another one telling us about this moment long ago. But that was one of the things that his Übermensch basically did, was also this retrieval of heroic value. I mean, for him, non-Christian values, because they were the very thing that this weakness was trying. I mean, when what Nietzsche called sort of the slave psychology aims to guilt the powerful from their place of privilege, if you will.
Right.
He called that sort of a Christian guilting, and in a sense, it works off of that in a perverted form. But the slave revolt, once it does it well, when Übermensch comes along, is no longer worried, suffers from that guilt consciousness, right?
Yep.
But what it is that drives them not only is their ability to not worry about being beyond good and evil, but it's also their embodiment of this kind of strong virtue. And I think that's what you see when so much failure and lack of courage and genuine virtues are not exhibited, not in the church, not anywhere else. That's the kind of stirring you start to get in those that can't take the direction anymore.
Yeah, I want to wrap up in a few minutes with some reflections on that, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Sheilaism, because you can't talk about Habits of the Heart and Robert Bellah without addressing Sheilaism. Now, Sheilaism, for listeners in Podclass land who are not familiar with this is kind of a shorthand for customized personal religion. And it comes actually out of an interview that the sociologist conducted with a woman named Sheila. And they're asking Sheila, her name is Sheila Larson, by the way, and they're asking her about her life and what she thinks and what she believes. Here's the description, and along with a quote. Sheila Larson is a young nurse who has received a good deal of therapy. That's a beautiful way to set it up. She, let's see, and who describes her faith as, quote, Sheilaism, end of quote. She goes on to say, I believe in God. I'm not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church. My faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, my own little voice.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, I tell you what, Sheila and the Sheilas of the world who are listening to this podcast, which probably aren't many because they're not the sort of people who listen to podcasts like this, but your voice won't carry you anywhere. It won't carry you anyway because it's insubstantial and it's not in touch with reality. But I want to finish with this. There are many churches that cater to Sheila. In fact, Sheila is their target, and they try to sort of mold and shape the Christian faith and squeeze it into Sheilaism.
Yes.
And anything that doesn't fit is just left out.
Yeah. This expressive self, or whatever you want to call it, that Sheilaism really is trying to capture, is so fostered by so much of the kind of modern or postmodern expressions of Christian faith, evangelicalism. And so it's I watch people step from this kind of Sheilaism approach to the happy clappy church that surrounds all their likes and their wants and their themselves, their expression of their faith. And then it moves right to all of a sudden they're taking yoga classes. I'm onto the yoga thing. But the next thing, they're taking kind of strange yoga classes.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, they're criticizing the evangelical church for not accepting other
Yoga.
selves. But then they move
Specifically goat yoga.
That's right, goat yoga and whatever else. It gets weirder. I've seen and I've heard and seen. But what ends up happening is then I've watched them go away from the church because the church has become it's hypocritical because it wants to value the self and promote this self, but on the other hand, it wants to put limits around it. And for people that don't fit into the church's accepted expressions of self, all of a sudden they see that. So next thing you know, they're either abandoning Christianity altogether, or they're going to churches that have abandoned Christianity altogether.
Yeah, XYZ. It's kind of fun to see the names that churches give themselves that are new church. We don't want to be associated with some denomination like Baptist or Presbyterian, so we're going to name ourselves exactly the same name as that XYZ mega church in the other part of the country. New Life River, whatever.
River of...
Well, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, all this stuff is just layer upon layer of self-deception and nonsense. But go ahead.
Well, that was a quick point. I mean, and maybe Glenn has a kind of historical aspect to this, but isn't this also very much tied to the way in which that denominational name, which used to be front and center, is tucked away and gone?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it the same set of cultural forces?
Yeah,
it is. What I'm struck by through all this is, I think it was C.S. Lewis. I'm not sure. I've been reading a lot of different people lately, and I think we've talked about this before. He said that it used to be that the goal of the person was to align themselves with reality.
Right.
Now the goal is to get reality to align with the self.
That's exactly
it's a gross paraphrase, but...
No, I think it's a fair paraphrase. I know the statement that you're referring to, and I think you've captured it really well. Yeah, I think that, as we think about Sheilaism and as we think about how to respond to this just complete self-absorption that we see around us. On the one, we've got plenty of biblical material to work with, and I'm all for using it. But I also think that we have, sort of a set of resources that are even, beyond or outside of those resources, and we shouldn't flinch from using those. What I'm getting at is that what we have is something we've talked about before in other shows, and just I've mentioned it already today. Is kind of we're living on the capital of the past. The people who founded the institutions that we have, which secure a way of life and a political constitution that we enjoy, we would not come up with today. That's what I'm getting at when we're talking about living on the capital of the past. Those institutions were created by a very different set of people, very much either biblical individualists or Republican individualists or some combination of the two. They weren't the others. Maybe you can argue that Franklin was a proto-utilitarian, and I think that's probably the best way to think of him. But, I think that the sort of example that of Franklin, I think perhaps is a little unfortunate. There could have been others, like, I don't know, P.T. Barnum or something.
Yeah.
But because he had enough of the others, other things still resident in him that you could identify those things in him. But what that means is that the new institutions, the institutions that we're founding now, really do reflect the more modern outlook, and they've got no capacity to kind of take us through the dark times that I think are already upon us, and I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we oftentimes is Protestants and Reformed in particular, sometime from a theological critique, is that open the door through its embrace of nominalism to basically this notion of Christian individuality. And there's some fair criticism when you look at how many Protestant denominations there are.
Yeah, right.
Everyone's open, can basically interpret the Bible their own way, right? But I think that's, first of all, I think it's unfair, and I don't think it was in any sense in line with what with the Reformation and Protestantism in its original vision set out. It saw itself as a renewal movement within classic Christianity, which meant classic Christianity governed its
Right.
reading frame. But as that setting loosens up, then something else starts to fill it very slowly, and these are these shifting ideas, and this is something this show is always trying to unpack. As these ideas come in, it is easy to slip from biblical notions of the dignity of the human individual, the priesthood of all believer, to these different senses, because it's happening so subtly at times that it's easy to stop. And so I think what you're seeing now is a dividing line happen, because you're either going to run one way or the other. You don't have these kind of overlap areas.
Right.
You're going to understand the human being radically different, human identity radically different, if you move in the direction that expressivism is ending up.
Yeah. Well, we should probably kind of bring this plane in for a landing. You got something you want to say, Glenn, and we're eager to hear it.
A couple of quick ideas. First of all, in the real critical theory world these days, you've moved past expressive individualism into with the concept of intersectionality that's usually used with respect to oppression. But another dimension of it is that everything that is true about you is true because of the particular set of approved classes that you're in.
Right.
You think the way you think because you are this race and that gender, any of the 60 some odd that they've got defined. You are, on and on and on, all of these different things. And so all you are is the product of your intersectional categories. You are no longer an individual.
Right.
You are also no longer part of a universal. So it's a radically different way of seeing the world that goes against everything in the Western tradition, going back to the Greeks. The distinction between universals and particulars, for example, is in critical theory false. The other thing that is worth noting is that wokeism is a Christian heresy.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche is the one who really points that out, this concern for the weak, concern for the oppressed, and things like that. Yeah. Even though he really distorts what Christianity is, what he says is actually very true of wokeism. And it does have Christian roots. In prior to Christianity, other cultures would have looked at what they're arguing and found it baffling or laughable, because the strong deserve to rule.
Yeah. Or the strong just are needed to rule because we have to actually enforce laws around here and keep the bad guys from taking our stuff.
Yeah. So this idea of concern for the weak and the oppressed and things like that, it's really comes from Christianity.
Yeah.
So,
any thoughts you want to give us as we wrap up, Tom?
No, there was a lot there. I guess one idea that came when Glenn was mentioning that is when you do get to a place at which you start to lose a self, and you get to start to become defined from the outside by a group and someone defining that group, as we're seeing with intersectionality, you are placed in the very easily manipulatable. And I think that's kind of end on that. I think that's where all of this stuff ends up.
Well, and my final thought on the matter is that the older views, both the biblical and the Republican, looked to the abilities and strengths of individuals and how those abilities and strengths could enrich the community. So the community is the place that is strengthened through the exercise of individual gifts in a wide range of areas, but everybody is valuable. Everybody makes a contribution, and the contributions are different, though. They're not exactly the same. They're based upon what you bring to the community, either because of the gifting of the spirit, spiritual gifts, or just because of natural talents and abilities. But that way of thinking has completely been lost. Wokeism does not make an argument at all for the gifts that weak people bring to a community. Their only service is to be weak, so that the people who are not weak, I guess, can feel good about themselves by helping them and And while there's a strange sort of inversion of Christian values here, I don't think it has legs. I don't think any way of thinking along those lines has any hope of surviving, because it takes so much for granted. Let me just finish on this last thought. So I was in Seattle the other day. I've been in Portland a few times now that I'm in the Pacific Northwest. And yes, you see the liberalism everywhere. You see all kinds of insanity. You see bumper stickers and people living in the street and all that stuff. But the thing that leapt out to me in both those places was the ubiquity of the guys, and there were always guys, in the yellow vests. Mm-hmm. Now, who are the guys in the yellow vests? Who are the men in the yellow vests? They're the construction workers. They're building the roads. They're building the skyscrapers. They're building, and they're cleaning up those areas where people have left debris and stuff. And there were literally thousands of these guys in both those places. The economy in those two cities is still booming.
Wow.
You can put your house on the market in the Portland area, and tomorrow it will be under contract, probably multiple bids. Partly because everybody's running from California. But they're bringing the disease with them. I think that's what a lot of people think. But in order to make all this stuff work, those guys in the yellow vests are essential. But they're also invisible. And what I mean by invisible is that the woke crowd don't see them. Or if they do see them, all they see are white men that are probably Trump voters and probably people they ought to be afraid of. They don't see people who actually built the road or the buildings that they're sleeping on or attacking with Molotov cocktails. And who provide the places of employment for all those taxpayers who provide the funds that create the social services that these people rely upon every day to eat or whatever. Those are the guys that I think, as I think about this, who are making a contribution every day through their work. Now they're just a lunch bucket crowd. They probably don't think about themselves in those terms, except when people that sort of denigrate them, which happens a lot. But we need more of those guys and fewer of the other types. That's enough for me. We've gone over. We should wrap it up. All right. Thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast, folks, and we'll talk to you again another time. Bye-bye.
Bye now.